Gladys was immediately shown the not-so-precious aspects of marriage as soon as she was forced to get the wedding ceremony over with at the church. But now, her most significant and darkest moments begin with challenges at the Blenheim Palace, and the real-life Consuelo Vanderbilt went through complicated struggles in her position as the Duchess. Many people are witnessing how Gladys is living her mother's dream rather than her own desires. Although the title of the Duchess might seem great, the huge palace was unbearable for her to live in and adjust to. One of the first struggles Gladys had to deal with in the show was her husband's sister, Lady Sarah, who became a big problem for her as soon as she married the Duke. But in real life, Consuelo's first struggle was trying to live with her mother-in-law, Albertha Spencer Churchill, who wasn't very nice and disliked Americans as she believed they were very primitive, which is hilarious because Consuelo's home in America had more bathrooms than the palace, as we dig more into the inconveniences and struggles Consuelo got in exchange of a title. Consuelo's mother-in-law thought all Americans lived on plantations with enslaved people and also made some racist remarks about Native Americans. At the time, English people didn't consider the Americans as equals, as they looked at a young American woman as a strange and abnormal creature. They thought they had the manners and habits shared by a Native American and a Gaiety girl. But making rude and crazy remarks about Consuelo was minor compared to the inconveniences her mother-in-law subjected her to in Blenheim. In the show, we see Gladys take Adelheid to England to train her replacement, who understands English culture and could take over as her lady's maid. However, it was a more brutal transition for Consuelo in reality. Consuelo's husband, the Duke, suggested her maid wouldn't be suitable for her once they arrived, and he had to write to his mother to have a maid familiar with the English ways waiting upon their arrival. The mother-in-law, knowing Consuelo was still a young 18-year-old, decided to make her time in Blenheim more miserable by picking a maid far beyond her age. Consuelo expressed her concerns about this in her book, stating that it wasn't just the age difference, but that the maid chosen for her was devoid of joy. The old maid was reportedly distant and hated men, especially the Duke. The maid was devoted to her job and lived in the palace with practiced loyalty, but she disliked young people for their noise and energy they radiate. Unlike when she was in America, being served by her age mate, who understood her position and needs, it was tough settling in Blenheim with a maid who only wanted to maintain quiet in the home. And it became a very boring situation for Consuelo because the maid hated the weekend parties, which were once the only relaxation Consuelo enjoyed after a busy week. It gets messy when you realize Consuelo was afraid of her maid and would tremble at the thought of suggesting they spend Sunday at one of her relaxation or party spots. These locations, which were at Esher, Taplow, and Hackwood, didn't have many rooms, and the maid was always angry that spending nights at such places meant she would have to share a room with the other maids. They even argue about this, and Consuelo would stand up to her to say, "You have 5 quiet days in the week. Don't grudge me my 2 gay ones." And the maid would reply, "You always have your room to yourself." Speaking of rooms, Consuelo also struggled desperately with them at Blenheim Palace. Although it's a huge home, it was almost unlivable for an American heiress used to more modern conveniences. The English were slow in adapting to modern infrastructures because the upper classes intentionally distanced themselves from technological advancements as they took pleasure in upholding their old and traditional practices over the perceived offensive modern artificial systems. So Consuelo moved from a convenient home to an old, cold, and drafty palace and was shocked at the state of Blenheim upon her arrival. By the time she arrived at the palace, their main room was undergoing renovation, and they had to sleep in a different room for the first 3 months of their marriage, which was uninviting, cold, lacked joy, and utterly depressing. Consuelo also described a room in the palace where Winston Churchill was born as haunted by the portrait of the private chaplain to the first Duke, Dean Jones, as people who slept in the room were terrified of his appearance. Aside from the dark, unlivable rooms, Consuelo also had a terrible time dining in the dark, high-ceilinged rooms and dressing up in a closet without ventilation. She mentioned that if the rooms had been beautifully designed and decorated, she would have been glad to see elegance and manage the discomfort. It's so wild that it was also revealed that the building was made by Vanbrugh, a playwright, before becoming an architect, who didn't design Blenheim to be a home but for dramatic arts. Even Alexander Pope had something to say about the palace, before he passed away in a criticism that says, "I never saw so great a thing with so much littleness in it." If the rooms were that terrible, think about the restroom, as it was also very inconvenient compared to what Consuelo enjoyed at home. The Blenheim has been reported to have 187 rooms with just one bathroom, while some have mentioned that it has a few bathrooms. And it was a constant struggle for Consuelo, as she also got into trouble with her maid, who prepared her bath water over this. The palace houses many other relatives, and they all had to share just a few bathrooms. Many of these other relatives have maids who must prepare the bathroom for use. The bathrooms are usually located in inconvenient places at the end of a passage, so there was a constant war among the maids to secure the bathroom for their ladies. The maids would queue up for the toilet, waiting with sponges, towels, and underwear for their turn. On one occasion, Consuelo's maid became very upset with her for not showing up at the bathroom after she had secured it. The maid said, "Twice have I prepared your bath tonight, and twice has it been stolen from me." Consuelo had to tell her that she would do without bathing, and this wasn't the only servant who undermined her in her home, where she ruled as a duchess. The nanny was another strong-willed servant Consuelo had a tough time with at the palace. Consuelo described the nanny, who also doubled as the head nurse, as a snobbish woman. After Consuelo had her second baby, Lord Ivor, the head nurse, was meant to hand over the first child, John, a marquess, to the second nurse so she could start caring for the new baby, as that was the usual standard. But the head nurse firmly declined to hand the first son over because he was still a baby, but mostly because he was a marquess, and the new baby, Lord Ivor, wasn't. Also, the head nurse didn't want to be in charge of the baby because she found pushing the baby stroller humiliating. But despite all of these, Consuelo was at least glad the head nurse didn't treat her sons or herself with bitterness whenever she went into the nursery. The servants at Blenheim weren't fond of her, as she had little knowledge of how things were done in England. And another servant who had a mild clash with Consuelo was the butler. One day, Consuelo needed help with the fire and had to ring the bell, and the butler answered her. Consuelo asked him to set a match to an already prepared fire, but the butler made a bow and left. Once outside the room, he replied to Consuelo, saying he would send the footman to light the fire. However, Consuelo said she would do it herself because she found the situation shocking. However, one thing about a royal English household is that the hierarchy of servants matters, and the butler was just too dignified to perform the task, even though he was already in the room and could have just lit it anyway. But the English were strict with all these rules, and the carefree American in Consuelo struggled to adjust. Despite her constant clashes with the servants, Consuelo was moved to improve their conditions beyond how she had found them. The housemaids of Blenheim Palace lived in a tower with no running water, and Consuelo aimed to improve their living situation, but she was stopped from doing what she wanted as a duchess. The excuse for stopping Consuelo from providing running water for the housemaids was that they had lived like that for nearly 2 centuries. So it didn't look right for the new generations of housemaids to enjoy the privilege of running water. Consuelo had to leave it as that, which limited her duty as a duchess in her home. Consuelo's move to England was the worst thing that had ever happened to her next to her sad wedding day, as she was extremely body shamed as soon as she got to Blenheim. They started talking about her neck, even in newspapers, and there were comments on how nature had been callous to an attractive duchess by cursing her with a long swan neck. The papers continued to write awkward things about her neck, as another reported that the inner circles of English society shook their heads and stared at her long neck for what seemed like forever. Seeing the high interest in her neck, Consuelo took it upon herself to invest heavily in gold and diamond jewelry to further adorn her neck, to the surprise of the English community. However, it became hilarious because people started wanting the swan necks and asked the artists creating their portraits to make their necks longer, and it became fashionable to have elongated necks, which they initially mocked Consuelo for. Many people are aware of Consuelo's loveless marriage, but most of that marriage was spent alone. Being incredibly lonely was one of her struggles as a duchess. Another was being unable to divorce her husband. So she spent most of her marriage to the Duke in isolation, as they became separated in 1906 and kept struggling and fighting for a divorce, which was fulfilled in 1921. And for a marriage so honored and filled with wealth and luxury, Consuelo struggled through it all, and she was trapped in her suffering, which lasted for 36 years before finally meeting a man she loved.